The man at the corral gate looked Verena Bower up and down the way a buyer looks at lame stock, and then he said it loud enough for the whole yard to hear that he'd been promised a wife and been sent a feed wagon instead. Her worth would not be measured by the width of her hips or the weight she carried up that dusty road, but by the wild things she could gentle that no hard man in that county had been able to touch. She stood at the bottom of the corral steps with her one carpetbag held against her belly like a shield, and she did not flinch when the laughter started behind her. 3 ranch hands sat along the top rail of the breaking pen, and one of them spat into the dust and said she'd snap the floor of the wagon clean through. She had heard worse on the boat over from Bremen, and worse than that in the boarding house in Sacramento, where they had paid her $4 a month to scrub and called her the fat Dutch girl to her face. She had stopped letting the words land where they could cut. She let them slide off her like rain off an oiled coat, and she kept her eyes on the man at the gate. The freight wagon that had carried her the last 40 miles sat behind her with its tailgate down, and the teamster who had driven it, a leathery old man named Quint, who had not spoken 6 words the whole 2 days, climbed down now and set her trunk in the dust beside her, a small flat-lidded trunk bound in 2 leather straps that held everything she owned in the world. He looked from the trunk to the silent yard, to the hard-faced rancher at the gate, and he understood the shape of the thing the way old men understand the shape of things, and he touched his hat brim to her, only to her, and said low, "Good luck to you, missus," and climbed back up and clucked to his team and rolled out of the yard, and the rattle of his wheels died away down the road, and then there was only the wind and the men on the rail, and the width of dusty ground between Verena Bower and the man who did not want her. She had counted on that wagon to be there a while yet. She had counted on a slow climb down, a how do you do, a man at least pretending. Instead she stood alone with her trunk at her feet, and a high desert she had never seen running silver to mountains she did not know the names of, 2 days east of the last town, with $4 to her name and no way back, and a man looking at her like a debt he regretted. A lesser-made woman would have sat down on that trunk and wept. Verena had wept once, on the boat, in the dark of the steerage hold 3 weeks out from Bremen, when a sailor had pinched the fat of her arm and laughed, and the other women had laughed too, and she had decided in that black hold, with the ocean groaning against the hull, that she had cried the last of the tears she could spare on what other people thought of her body. There were not many left after that. She had been saving them for things that mattered. His name was Holt Mercer, and he owned the place, or what was left of it, and he stood there in the low gold light of late afternoon with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his jaw set hard as a wagon brake. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean and weathered, with a brown wide-brim hat pushed back off a sweat-darkened forehead and 3 days of dark stubble on a face that had forgotten how to be soft. He wore a cream work shirt, gone gray at the collar, and a leather vest worn pale at the seams, and a holstered revolver rode his hip the way an old habit rides a man. He looked dangerous. He was, she would learn, the safest man for 200 miles, but on that first afternoon he only looked at her like a mistake he could not afford. Before this goes any further, let me ask one small thing of you, friend, and then I will not interrupt the story again. Drop the name of your town in the comments down below so I can see just how far Verena Bauer's story travels tonight. From her dusty corner of Nevada all the way to wherever your lamp is burning. And if you find your heart pulling for this heavy-set Dutch girl nobody wanted, stay with her clear to the end, because the people who laughed in that yard had no idea what was walking through Holt Mercer's gate. Now, let me tell you how she came to be standing there at all, in that dusty yard at the far edge of nowhere, 2 days east of the last real town, with her whole life folded into one small trunk and a carpetbag, and no road home. The letter that brought her had been written by a woman named Cora Pruitt, who ran a marriage agency out of a narrow office in Sacramento and made her living trading lonely men their loneliness for a fee. Verena had answered an advertisement in a German-language paper because she was 26 years old and her father was 3 years dead, and her wages were never going to be more than $4 a month for the rest of her life. The advertisement had asked for a hard-working Christian woman of sound constitution willing to keep a frontier home. It had not asked what she weighed. Cora Pruitt had taken one look at her across the desk, and her pen had paused over the paper, and Verena had watched the woman decide that a man desperate enough would not be choosy. The man, it turned out, had not been asked at all. Holt Mercer had written Cora Pruitt for a cook and a housekeeper and a pair of working hands, a wife in the practical frontier sense, because his own hands could not keep his place and gentle his horses both, and there were not enough hours in a day for one widowed man to do the work of 3. He had sent $11 for the arrangement and the stage fare, and he had described his needs in 4 plain lines, and he had not thought to specify a size, because what kind of man specifies the size of the woman who will share the rest of his life? Cora Pruitt had read those 4 plain lines and seen a man too far out and too hard up to send anyone back, and she had matched him with the woman nobody else would take, and she had pocketed her fee, and she had washed her hands of both of them. So Verena had ridden the stage from Sacramento to Carson City, and then a freight wagon another 40 miles east into the high desert, where the sage ran silver to the foot of bare brown mountains, and the wind never quit. And she had climbed down stiff and bruised at the Mercer place with the dust of 2 days on her, expecting a man who had at least known she was coming. And she had watched his face fall when he saw her. That was the part that stung. Not the ranch hands, not the boarding house. The way a stranger's hope died in his eyes the moment he counted the width of her. "You're not what I paid for," Holt Mercer said. The yard went quiet. Even the wind seemed to drop for a breath. Verena set her carpetbag down in the dust. "No," she said. Her English was careful and lightly accented, every word set down like a careful foot on bad ground. "But I am here, and I can work." "I paid Cora Pruitt for a cook and 2 hands," Holt said. He had not moved from the gate. "I wrote her plain. I never asked for—" He stopped himself an inch short of the cruel word, and the stopping was almost worse because they both heard the shape of the word in the silence where he left it. "For a fat one," Verena finished for him, flat, doing him the courtesy of saying it so he would not have to. "No, Cora Pruitt did not write you that part. She took your money. She is not here to give it back. So," she lifted her chin a degree, "you have a cook. You have 2 hands. You have a woman who will not run the place's stores to ruin and will not flinch from any work you put in front of her. What you do not have is a way to send me back tonight, because the wagon is gone and the next stage west is Thursday. We are stuck with each other until Thursday, Mr. Mercer, you and I. After that, if you still want me gone, you may pay my fare, and I will go and trouble you no further. Until then, I would like to see your kitchen, because those men have not eaten a proper supper in some while by the look of them. It was the longest speech anyone had made in that yard in a month, and it landed in the dust between them and sat there, and Holt Mercer found he had nothing to put against it. One of the ranch hands on the rail laughed again, a long, mean sound, and called out that the only work she looked fit for was eating a man out of house and home. His name was Del Stroud, the foreman, a rangy fellow with a sunburnt neck and pale eyes, and he would be saying cruel things in this story for a good long while before he ran out of them. Holt Mercer did not laugh, but he did not tell Del to shut his mouth either, and that silence was its own kind of cruelty. And Verena heard it. She bent and picked up her bag. "Where do I sleep?" she said, not a question, a door she was going to walk through whether he held it or not. Holt looked at the bunkhouse and looked at the small slope-roofed cabin that had been his and his dead wife's, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not read. "Cookhouse has a room off the back," he said at last. "Was the old cook's? You take that." It was 8 feet by 10, with a rope bed and a washstand, and a window the size of a dinner plate looking out at the corrals. It smelled of cold ash and mouse. On the windowsill, left behind by whoever had the room before her, sat a chipped white china cup with a faded blue band around the rim and a dried sprig of something in it that had once been sage flower, and Verena picked it up and turned it in the last of the light and set it back down. And the small abandoned tenderness of it, somebody's flower in somebody's cup in a room nobody had wanted either, undid her more than all of Del Stroud's words had. Verena set her bag on the bed and stood in the middle of it and let herself feel, for exactly as long as it took the sun to slide behind the western ridge, the full and crushing weight of how far she had come to be unwanted all over again. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to find the kitchen, because a woman who lets the feeling stay too long is a woman who stops moving, and Verena Bauer had not survived an ocean and a continent by stopping. The Mercer place was dying. She saw it that first evening with the clear eye of someone who had nothing to lose by seeing true. The garden was a square of cracked dirt with 2 dead tomato vines staked in it. The cookhouse stores were down to flour going to weevil, a side of salt pork on the color of an old saddle, a sack of beans, coffee, and not much besides. There were 9 men to feed, counting Holt, and the bunkhouse table, when she found it, was sticky with old grease and crowded with tin plates nobody had washed in days. She stood in the doorway of that filthy kitchen with her sleeves rolled to her heavy forearms, and she took its measure the way a general takes the measure of a field, and then she went to work, and the work was the first language Verena Bauer had ever truly been fluent in. She hauled the dead ash from the firebox in a coal scuttle and laid a fresh fire and got it drawing. She found the well and a wooden bucket and carried water until the big iron kettle was full and singing. She scoured the table with sand and lye soap until the grain of the wood showed pale again under 20 years of grease, and she scalded the tin plates, and she went through the stores shelf by shelf, and threw out what was rotten and salvaged what was not. In the back of the lowest shelf, behind a tin of saleratus gone to a brick, She found a stone crock of sorghum molasses, 3/4 full that the men had not known was there, and she lifted it out into the lamplight like a small dark treasure, because molasses meant she could make the cornbread sweet, and a sweet thing set in front of hard-used men is a kind of mercy they will not know to thank you for. She made a pot of beans with the salt pork, picked clean of the rind that had soured, and a great skillet of cornbread sweetened with the found molasses. And she set it out in the middle of the scrubbed table without a word, and went back to her 8-by-10 room. She did not see from in there how the men ate, but she heard, through the thin board wall, the talk drop off and then stop, and then a young voice say into the silence, wondering that he'd forgot bread could taste like that, and then the long scrape of plates being cleaned with the last of the cornbread. And in the morning the bean pot was empty, and somebody had washed it and set it upside down to dry on the clean table, which she had not asked anyone to do. There was a ledger in the cookhouse that the old cook had kept, a worn brown account book with a cracked spine, and Verena opened it her second morning when she sat down to take stock of the stores, and she read it the way she read everything, slowly and clear to the end, because her father had taught her that you cannot mind a thing well that you have not first understood entirely. The accounts told her the rest of what the dead garden had only started to say. Tucked into the back of the ledger, folded in 3, was the contract itself, on heavy government paper with a printed seal at the top, and Verena smoothed it flat on the table and read it twice. Holt Mercer had contracted with the United States Army to deliver 40 gentled saddle horses to the cavalry remount agent at Carson City. Each one broke to the bit and steady and quiet enough to carry a green recruit, and that contract, she understood quickly, was the only plank still holding the man up over the water. 40 head, the paper said, at $38 apiece, $1,520 all told, the whole of it payable only on delivery, and only if delivered entire by the 1st day of October, and if he came up so much as 1 horse short, the contract was forfeit, the bond lost, and a season's wages and feed, and the place's last credit at the Carson Bank gone with it. The Army did not pay 1 cent for a green outlaw that pitched a frightened farm boy onto the hard ground of the receiving corral. It paid for a horse a scared 17-year-old recruit could sit through his first thunderstorm and his first gunfire. The whole difference between those 2 animals Verena saw, the difference between a ruined horse and a soldier's mount, was the difference between Holt Mercer keeping his land and losing it, and it came down to a kind of work that every hard man on the place was doing exactly wrong. It was the 9th of August. By Verena's count, that left her 53 days, though she did not yet know it was her count to keep. She learned the rest at the corrals, watching the way she always learned. Holt Mercer ran Mustangs, not the soft ranch-bred colts that came up gentled at their mother's side, but wild horses gathered off the open range, mature animals 4 and 5 and 6 years old that had never felt a hand, that had run the basins free their whole lives and would sooner die than be caught. He had 43 of them in his pens, and he had until the 1st of October to make 40 soldiers' mounts out of them, and the way he was going about it was killing him, because the way Holt Mercer broke a horse, and the way Del Stroud broke a horse, and the way every hard man in that county broke a horse, was to rope it and choke it down and snub it to a post and let it fight the rope until it could not stand, and then throw a saddle on the shaking, sweat-soaked, broken-spirited thing and ride it until it quit bucking or quit breathing. They called it breaking, and the word was honest, because that was exactly what it did. It broke them. Some came out the far side dull and sullen and unsafe, flinching at shadows, liable to blow up under a soldier a year later when the memory came back. Some came out with a bowed tendon or a wrenched stifle and were no good for the army or anyone. And some, the wildest and the proudest, did not come out at all. There was a black stallion in the far pen that had already half killed 2 men. Verena saw him on her 3rd morning. She had carried a bucket of scraps out to the chickens that pecked around the cookhouse, and her path took her along the rail of the far corral, and she stopped because she had never in her life seen anything so angry and so afraid at the same time. He was a big horse, black as a whetstone, with a ragged forelock and a wild white-rimmed eye and a body laced with the pale scars of old fights. He stood jammed into the back corner of the pen with his haunches against the rails and his head up and his nostrils blown wide, and when she stopped, he wheeled to face her and struck the ground once with a forefoot, a hard, flat crack like a rifle, and Verena did not move. She knew that horse, not him exactly, but the shape of him. She had been raised in horse country in the old world, in the green hill farms outside Bremen, where her father had been a man who gentled the great heavy farm horses that the Junkers brought him, the ones that had been beaten stupid by impatient grooms and could no longer be handled. Her father had been a small, quiet man with enormous, gentle hands that looked too big for the rest of him, and Verena could still see him as plain as the horse in front of her, standing in the cold of their stone barn on a winter morning, with his breath smoking, his hand flat on the neck of a great trembling Holstein gelding that 2 grooms and a riding master had given up as a man-killer, doing nothing, saying nothing, only standing hour after hour until the horse stopped shaking. He had taught Verena before she was 10 that you cannot drive the fear out of a horse with more fear, that fear and force only teach a horse that men are the thing to be feared, and that the only way through a frightened animal is to become the one safe thing in its whole world, and then to wait, longer than you think you can bear to wait, for it to choose you. The waiting was the trade, he used to say. Any fool could throw a rope. The waiting was the trade. He had a braided horsehair rope he had made himself over 3 winters from the tail hairs of every horse he had ever gentled, soft and supple as a length of cloth, gray and brown and black plaited fine, and he had pressed it into her hands the week the lung fever took him, when Verena was 23, and told her it would gentle anything in the world but death. It was the only thing of value she owned. It was coiled at the bottom of her carpet-bag in the 8-by-10 room, wrapped in the same oilcloth he had wrapped it in, and she had not thought, when she packed it to cross the ocean, that she would ever have cause to use it again. She had thought she was going to America to scrub floors. She stood at the rail of the far corral a long time that 3rd morning, not moving toward the black horse, not away, just letting him look at her and learn the harmless fact of her. And the men breaking a sorrel in the near pen stopped to watch her stand there, and Del Stroud called out across the yard, asking if she meant to sit on the outlaw or just feed him into giving up. She did not answer, but she marked the stallion in her mind, the way her father had taught her to mark the hopeless ones, the ones everybody else had given up. There was always one, and the one everybody had given up on was always in the end the one that proved you. By that count, 51 days remained. The first proof of her was not the stallion, It was a foal. On the fifth night, a thunderstorm rolled down off the mountains, the dry kind that the high desert breeds, all wind and lightning, and not enough rain to wet the dust. And it spooked the gentle band in the low pasture, where Holt kept the few brood mares and their colts that were his hope for next year's contract. In the dark and the noise, a young mare went through a section of bad fence, and her foal, a leggy bay thing not 3 months old, went down in the dry wash below the pasture and could not get up. They found it at dawn, the men did, lying on its side in the gravel with its near foreleg twisted under it and its breath coming in fast little grunts, and the mare standing over it frantic. And Del Stroud took one look and went to the bunkhouse for his rifle. Verena had come out with the breakfast coffee. She set the pot down on a fence post and went down into the wash in her blue work dress, with her skirts gathered in one fist, and she knelt in the gravel beside the foal, and she put her hands on it. "Wait," she said. Del came back with the rifle and stopped at the lip of the wash. Holt was there by then, and the other men, a half ring of them up on the bank looking down. "Leg's broke," Del said. "Kind as thing's a bullet." "It is not broke," Verena said. She did not look up at him. Her hands were moving slow and sure down the foal's twisted leg, feeling each joint the way her father's hands had moved 1,000 times in the old barn. It is caught, the hoof is wedged, under the stone there. He has fought it, and he is tired, and he thinks he is dying. He is not dying. "You a horse doctor now?" Del said. "No," she said. "I am the daughter of one. Bring me the flat of that shovel and a man to hold his head." Nobody moved, and then Holt Mercer came down into the wash. He did not say anything. He knelt at the foal's head and got a knee under its neck and his hands around its jaw, gentle, gentler than she would have guessed those hands could be, and he held the small wild head still against the gravel and looked across the trembling body at her. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Hold him. Talk low. He listens to you because you are not afraid." She worked the flat shovel blade under the wedged hoof, slow, talking the whole time in a low, steady stream of German her grandmother had used. Nonsense, lullaby. It did not matter what the words were, only that they never stopped and never sharpened. She levered the stone a half-inch, and the hoof came free, and the foal kicked once, hard, and she rode the kick and did not let go. And then she had the leg straight along the gravel, and her broad, soft hand flat on the foal's shoulder, holding it down, holding it still, until the fast, grunting breath slowed and went quiet. The leg was whole, bruised, skinned at the pastern, but whole. She had felt every joint of it, and there was no break, and she had been right, and the rifle stayed unfired on the bank. "Let him up slow," she said. "Stay between him and the rocks." The foal came up wobbling and stood 3-legged a moment, then put weight on the bruised leg, then more, and then it lurched to its frantic mother and shoved its nose under her flank and began to nurse, its tail switching alive. And up on the bank a man let out a breath he'd been holding, and Del Stroud lowered the rifle and said nothing at all, which from Del was a great deal. Holt Mercer stood up out of the gravel and looked at the foal nursing, and then at the heavy-set Dutch girl kneeling in the wash, with the knees of her blue dress soaked through, and her arms gray with dust to the elbow. And Verena looked up and met his eyes, and for the first time since she had climbed down off that freight wagon, the man did not look at her like a mistake. He looked at her like a question he had not known to ask. "Coffee's getting cold," she said, and got up and climbed out of the wash. And that was the morning the Mercer place started to change, though not one of them could have told you so at the time. 50 days remained. She knew it because she had taken to keeping the count herself in the cookhouse ledger, in a small, neat hand under the old cook's accounts. 40 head to gentle by the 1st of October. The thought of it sat in the back of her mind all day like a stone in a shoe, because she had read the contract, and she had watched the breaking, and she could see as plain as the dead garden that at the rate the men were going, snubbing and choking and fighting 2 horses to a standstill in a day and ruining one of every 3, Holt Mercer was going to come up short. And short by even 5 head meant the whole contract forfeit. She had done that arithmetic too. She did not say so. It was not her place, and she knew exactly how a remark like that would land in that yard, the fat cook with opinions on horses. So she fed them, and she scrubbed the table, and she planted the dead garden over with what seed she could scrounge, turnips and late beans and a row of carrots that might or might not make before frost, and in the early mornings before the men were up, and the late evenings after the supper plates were cleaned, she went and stood at the rail of the far corral with the black stallion. She brought nothing the first week, just herself. She would carry a low milking stool out across the dark yard before the light came up, while the men still slept, and the only sound was the wind and the chickens stirring, and she would set it just outside the rail of the far corral, 10 feet from the horse, and lower her broad weight onto it, and fold her hands in her lap, and drop her eyes to the dust, and wait. That was all. That was the whole of it. She did not look at the stallion, because a level stare from a wide-set pair of eyes is the look of a predator choosing its meal, and a horse reads it that way down in the oldest part of itself. She did not reach. She did not speak. She sat with her eyes down, and her hand still, and her breath slow and even, and she let the wild black horse spend his fear on a shape that gave him nothing to fear, and morning by morning she let him do the only work that mattered, which was to study her and to learn the harmless, boring fact of her, the way you learn that a stump by a familiar trail is only a stump. The first morning he ran the rails the whole time she sat there, wheeling and blowing and crashing into the corner, fighting a fight nobody was offering him. The second morning he ran less. The third morning he stopped in the middle of the pen and turned and faced her and struck the ground and snorted, daring her to be a danger, and she folded her hands and looked at the dust and was no danger at all, and it confused him, because everything that had ever come to that rail had wanted to rope him. The fourth morning he stood and watched and pawed. The fifth morning he stood quiet in the back corner and watched her with both ears pricked forward, which is an entirely different thing than watching with one ear back. The difference between a horse braced to flee and a horse beginning, against its own deep judgment, to be curious. And on the 6th morning, when Verena rose stiff from the stool to go and start the men's coffee, the black stallion took one step, one single, deliberate step, toward the empty place where the wide, quiet shape had been sitting. One step. She told no one, but she wrote it in the ledger, in the margin, a tiny mark, the way her father used to. The men, of course, found out she was going to the stallion. There is no privacy on a ranch, and the finding out made for a fine joke at supper, the kind that goes around a table and comes back funnier each lap. Del Stroud led it. He said the cook had fallen in love with the only thing on the place uglier and meaner than she was. He said when the outlaw finally killed somebody, he hoped it'd be her, so they could save on flour. He said it loud, and he said it grinning, and the younger hands laughed because they were afraid of Dell, and it was easier to laugh than to be the next one he turned on. Verena set the cornbread down in the middle of the table and looked at Del Stroud for a moment, just a moment, and what was in her face was not hurt and was not anger. It was pity. The cold, clean pity of a person who has been hated by experts and knows that the hating costs the hater more than the hated. "Eat," she said. "It's getting cold." And she went back to her room, and behind her the table was quiet in a way it had not been before, because pity from the bottom of the order is a hard thing for a man like Dell to swallow. Holt Mercer had not laughed. Verena had marked that too. He sat at the head of the table with his coffee long after the others had scraped their plates and shuffled out to the bunkhouse. And when she came out later for the dishes, he was still there alone in the lamplight, turning his tin cup slow in his two hands. And he did not look up at her. And after a while he said the thing that had been sitting behind his silence. That black horse killed Tom Avery back in the spring. His thumb went around the rim of the cup. Tom was a good hand, steady. We roped that stud and snubbed him to the post in the breaking pen, and Tom went to throw the saddle on the way you do, the way we always done, and the horse came up off all 4 feet and threw Tom into the rails and stove his chest in like a barrel. He lived 2 days. A long pause, the cup turning. 19 years old. I wrote his mother in Ohio. Still don't know what I said in the letter. He set the cup down. I shouldn't have bought that horse. Got him cheap at the Reno yards because every other man there knew better. Told myself I could break anything. He shook his head once. You should stay off him, Verena. I've buried enough. Tom Avery roped him, Verena said. It was not a question. Holt looked up at her then. Roped him and choked him and fought him, she said quietly, gathering the plates. And the horse learned that a man is a rope and a rope is death, and he believed it because it was true. I am not going to rope him, Mr. Mercer. I am going to teach him I am not a rope. That takes longer, but nobody dies of it. She carried the plates out. Holt Mercer sat a long time with his cold coffee, and the thing in his chest that had been frozen since they put his wife and his unborn child in the ground 2 winters back shifted just slightly, like river ice in the first warm wind, with a sound nobody could hear. There was a thing that happened over a supper around then that mattered more than it looked, the way the things that matter most often wear the plainest clothes. Verena had killed and dressed 2 of the old hens that had stopped laying, the way a farm woman does when a hen's working life is over, and rather than boil them tough, she had done what her mother used to do on a feast day in the old country, browned them slow in their own fat with the wild onions she had dug along the creek, and a handful of the new turnip greens, and a spoon of the found molasses to round it, and she had made dumplings to go in the broth, and she set the great pot of it down in the middle of the scrubbed bunkhouse table on a cold evening, when the men came in, gray-faced and beaten from the breaking pen. They ate like men who had forgotten food could be a kindness. And Holt Mercer, at the head of the table, took 1 bite of the browned hen and the broth and the dumpling, and he stopped. He set his fork down. He sat very still for a moment, with his eyes on his plate, and Verena, coming through with the bread, saw his throat work, and saw what the food had done to him, which was to reach back 2 years to the last table a woman had cooked for him with care and lay that whole buried grief open in one mouthful of his dead wife's kind of supper. He did not weep. A man like Holt does not weep at a table full of his hands. But he sat there a long moment mastering himself, and then he looked up and found Verena watching him, and he said low only to her, "Thank you." And it was not a thank you for the meal. She knew exactly what it was a thank you for. She nodded once and went on with the bread, and let the man have his grief in private at his own table, and that was the supper, if you want to mark one, where Holt Mercer began, without knowing it, to come back to life. 46 days. The turnip row came up in a green haze of seedlings. Verena thinned them on her knees in the cool of the morning and carried water from the well in 2 buckets on a yoke across her broad shoulders, and the carrying of it, the steady, patient labor that nobody else would do, began to tell on the place in small ways. The men ate better and fought less. The sticky table stayed clean. There were eggs again because she had doctored the hens for the mites that had stopped their laying, sulfur and ash in the nest boxes, an old farm trick, and the hens came back in to lay within the week, 11 of them, and the men who had eaten salt pork and beans for a month wept a little inside over fresh eggs and did not say so to each other. And the stallion let her into the pen. It happened on the morning of the 44th day before the deadline, and she had not planned it, which is the only way such a thing can happen. She had her father's braided horsehair rope with her by then, soft over her shoulder, and she had been sitting on the low stool inside the rails for 3 mornings running, because the horse had let her through the gate without bolting, and that was a country she had crossed slow and on purpose. On this morning he came to her. He had been standing in his corner, and she had been sitting and breathing, and the sun came up over the eastern ridge and laid its first warm light across the pen, and the black horse blew out a long breath that was not a snort, dropped his head an inch, and walked across the pen to where she sat, and stopped with his scarred chest a foot from her shoulder, and lowered his muzzle, and breathed against her hair. Verena did not turn her head. She did not lift a hand. She breathed back, slow, into his flared nostril, the way her father had taught her, so that the horse could learn the smell of her and know it was the smell of the safe thing. They stayed like that while the light climbed the pen rail, the wild black stallion and the heavy-set Dutch girl, breathing each other's breath, and then she very slowly raised one broad, soft hand, palm flat, and laid it on the side of his neck where the scars were, and he flinched hard, his whole hide twitching, and he did not run. "There," she said low. "There, you see, nothing, just a hand that wants nothing." She stood there with her flat hand resting on the scarred neck of the horse that had killed a man, and she felt the great heart slamming under her palm, slower with every breath. And she felt the moment it happened, the moment her father had spent his whole life chasing and teaching her to wait for, the moment a wild thing stops merely tolerating you and decides, somewhere too deep for either of you to name it, to trust you. It came through the horse's hide into her hand like warmth coming into a cold room. He leaned just slightly into her touch. 1,000 pounds of fear and scars leaned a half-inch toward the one shape in the world that had asked nothing of him, and Verena Bauer closed her eyes for a moment in the cold gold morning and let herself, just that once, feel it back. She named him in her mind that morning, though she would not say it aloud for a while yet. She named him Kohle, the German word for coal, for the black of him and for the banked fire of him that had only ever needed a hand instead of a whip. And from that morning forward the work with him was only a matter of days, and she had counted those, and there were 44 of them, and she thought, standing there with her hand on a killer horse gone quiet, for the first time since she had climbed down off that wagon, that it might just be enough. She did not see Holt Mercer standing at the cook-house corner in the early light, watching her lay her hand on a horse that had killed a man, but he saw her. He stood there with his coffee going cold in his fist, and he watched the thing happen that he had been told all his life could not happen. The gentling of a wild horse with nothing but patience and a flat hand and time, and he understood standing there that the woman Cora Pruitt had sent him to be a joke was the best horseman he had ever seen in his life, and that he had let his men laugh at her, and the shame of that went through him cold and clean. That evening he did a thing he had not done. He came to the cook-house after the others had eaten and gone, and he sat down at the clean table, and he said, "Show me." Verena was scraping the skillet. She stopped. "Show you what?" "What you do with him, the black. I want to bring the rest along that way, the Mustangs." He turned his hat in his hands. "I've been killing them and breaking myself to do it, and I'm going to come up short and lose the place anyway. I watched you this morning. I don't understand what I saw. Teach me." It cost him something to say it, she could see. A hard man, a rancher 15 years on his own ground, sitting at his own table, asking the fat cook off the wagon to teach him his own trade. She set the skillet down on the stove and dried her hands on her apron and sat across from him, because a thing said that plain deserves to be answered sitting down. "It is not a trick," she said. "There is no trick. There is only one thing, and everything else comes out of it. You stop being the thing they are afraid of. That is all. A horse fights because it believes you mean to hurt it, and as long as it believes that, it will fight you till one of you is broken. Take away the believing, and you take away the fight. It is slow at the very start. Those first days are slow. You sit and you wait, and it feels like doing nothing. And then all at once it is very fast, faster than roping, because a horse that trusts you learns in an afternoon what a frightened horse will not learn in a month." She looked at the lamp. "But you are right, that we do not have the days to do it one slow horse at a time, 40 horses, one by one, so we do not. There is a faster way, and my father did it one hard winter with a whole barn full of ruined Junker carriage horses that 3 riding masters had given up on. You make a herd that is already calm, the brood mares, the foal, the ones that already trust a hand, and then you put the wild ones in among the calm ones, 2 and 3 at a time, and you let the calm ones do the teaching for you. A wild horse will not believe a man for a month, but it will believe the quiet mare grazing beside it inside of one day, because the mare is not lying to it. The mare is simply not afraid, and there is no faster teacher in the world than that. We let the herd gentle the herd. We use Cola once he leads. We use the foal's mother. We make your horses teach your horses, and we make the deadline." "Cola," Holt said. "The black. I named him Cole." Holt Mercer looked at her across the clean table in the lamplight, this big, quiet woman with flour on her sleeve and her dead father's horse sense in her broad, capable hands, and something happened in his weathered face that had not happened in 2 years. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the foundation of one. "All right," he said. "Cole, we do it your way. God help me, we do it your way." 43 days. And the count, from that night, was no longer hers alone. It was theirs. What followed was the kind of work that does not photograph and does not make a song, the slow, patient remaking of a herd and a man and a place. And I will not pretend to you it went smooth, because it did not. Del Stroud fought her every step. When Holt told the men at breakfast that they would gentle the Mustangs the cook's way with patience in the calm herd, and that there would be no more roping and choking in the breaking pen, Del Stroud stood up from the table and threw his cup against the wall. "You're going to lose the Army contract on a fat woman's say-so," Del said. His face was dark with it. "We've got 40 head to break and 43 days to do it, and you want to sit on stools and breathe at them. I've broke horses 15 years. My pa broke horses. You break a horse by breaking it. There's no other way, and there never was. And you're a fool, Holt, and she's made you a fool." The bunkhouse went still. Holt Mercer stood up too, slow, and he was not a big man, but the room got small around him. "I buried a wife and a child," he said, very quiet. "I buried Tom Avery. I've got a place that's dying and a way of doing things that's killing it, and this morning I watched that woman put her hand on the black stallion that stove in Tom's chest, and he stood for it like a lamb. So you tell me, Del, which one of us is the fool, the one trying something new, or the one who'd rather lose it all than be wrong?" He let that sit. "You can break them your way on your own ranch. On mine, we do it hers." Del Stroud looked around the table for the laughter that had always been there for him, and did not find it, because the men had eaten her eggs and her cornbread and seen her save the foal, and the wind had shifted in that bunkhouse, and Del was the last to feel it. He grabbed his hat off the peg. "Pay me out," he said. "I won't be here to watch you go under." "I'll pay you to the day," Holt said. "You're free to ride." But Del Stroud did not ride. That was the thing Verena marked and did not say. He took his pay to the day, and he stayed on, sullen, doing the bare work, because the truth was Del had nowhere else to go, and no place else would have him. And a man like that, cornered and shamed, does not ride away. He waits, he nurses it. And Verena, who had been hated by experts, knew the difference between a man who leaves and a man who stays to even a score, and she watched her back from that morning on. He found her alone 2 evenings later at the well, when she was drawing the night water with the windlass, and the rest of the crew was at supper. He came up on the dark side of her, close, too close, smelling of the whiskey he had taken to keeping in the bunkhouse, and he put one boot up on the well coping and leaned over her, and his pale eyes in the dusk were the eyes of a man who has decided to hate a thing, because hating it is easier than facing what it has shown him about himself. "You think you won something," Del said low, so it would not carry. "Cooking your sweet bread and petting their heads and making my own crew look at me like I'm the fool. 15 years I run this man's horses. Then you waddle in off a wagon, and in a month I'm nothing." He leaned closer. "A horse can be gentled, Missy." "Sure. But a horse can also break a leg in the dark and have to be shot. And nobody asks too many questions about a thing that happens in the dark on a ranch. You remember that?" Verena did not step back. She had been backed against worse things than Del Stroud in worse dark, with less to lose. She set the full bucket down on the coping between them, slow, deliberate, so the weight of it sat there as a small reminder of what her arms could do, and she looked up into his face without one flicker of the fear he had come to draw out of her. "You are not angry that I cook sweet bread, Mr. Stroud," she said, even and quiet. "You are angry that the horses are not afraid of me, and you have spent your whole life believing fear was the only thing that made them mind. So if they will mind without fear, then all that fear you have handed out to the horses and the boys and to me was never the trade you thought it was. It was only cruelty. And a man does not like to learn at 50 that his whole trade was only cruelty." She lifted the bucket. "Stand out of my light. I have water to carry." And she walked past him into the lamplight of the cookhouse, and behind her, in the dark Del Stroud, stood at the well a long time, and a thing that had been only sullen in him curdled that night into something worse. And Verena knew it, and she said nothing to anyone, because there was no proof in a feeling, and a fat woman's feeling about a foreman least of all. But she began, from that night, to keep the lantern lit late, and to sleep light, and to count the days not only down to the Army's deadline, but down to whatever it was she could feel coming on the dark side of the well. 43 days. They built the gentle herd. It was the most beautiful work Verena had done since her father died, and she gave herself to it the way she gave herself to everything, completely and without complaint. They took the brood mares and the yearlings and the foals she had saved, the animals that already trusted a hand, and they made of them a calm, steady band in the big pasture, and then, 2 and 3 at a time, they cut wild mustangs out of the holding pens and turned them in with the gentle herd, and the thing her father had promised happened, the thing that looks like magic and is only the deepest kind of sense. The wild horses, panicked and pitching at first, found themselves surrounded not by men with ropes, but by horses standing quiet, grazing, switching flies, unafraid. And a horse believes other horses. A wild mustang will not believe a man for weeks who tells it the world is safe. But it will believe the mare beside it in a single afternoon, because the mare is not lying. The mare is simply not afraid, and fear and the absence of fear are both catching in a herd. She showed Holt the first turning out herself, because he did not yet believe it, and a man has to see a thing to believe it. They cut 3 of the wildest mustangs out of the holding pen at dawn, 3 that had fought the rope and would have taken a week each of choking and snubbing the old way, and instead of roping them, they simply opened the gate between the holding pen and the big pasture where the calm band grazed, and stood back and let the wild ones go through on their own. The 3 mustangs burst into the pasture at a dead run, heads high, ready for the chase that always came, ready to fight and flee, and nothing chased them. There was only a wide green pasture and 40 quiet horses grazing in the morning sun, lifting their heads to look, unconcerned, and going back to their grass. The 3 wild ones ran the fence twice, looking for the danger, and could not find it, and at last, baffled, they slowed and stopped, and one of them dropped its head and tore a mouthful of grass, because a horse standing in a herd of calm horses cannot stay afraid for long, fear and calm being equally catching among them, and by noon all 3 were grazing in the band as if they had been born to it. Holt Mercer watched the whole morning from the fence without a word, and when the last wild one put its head down to graze, he turned to Verena with an expression she would remember all her life, a hard man watching the foundation of everything he thought he knew quietly rearrange itself. After that, the work only deepened. Within 3 days, a wild horse turned out, with the calm band, would be grazing among them. Within a week, it would let Verena walk through the herd and lay a hand on it in passing, just a touch, the herd's calm vouching for her the way a trusted friend vouches for a stranger. Within 2 weeks, it would take a halter and lead and stand for a saddle blanket laid soft across its back, and Holt Mercer, who had spent 15 years fighting horses into the ground one bloody one at a time, stood at the pasture fence and watched 8 half-wild mustangs gentling themselves inside a calm herd faster than he could have broken 2, and he took his hat off and ran his hand through his hair and laughed out loud once, a rusty, unused sound like a barn door hinge that had not turned in years. "I'll be damned," he said. "I'll be purely damned." "You will not," Verena said, working a halter onto a dun mare's nose, not looking up. "You will be solvent." And he laughed again, the second laugh easier than the first, and that was the day, if I had to put my finger on a day, that Holt Mercer began to love her, though it would be a while yet before either of them had the courage to call it by its name. There was a sorrel mare in the second batch of wild ones that nearly beat them, and the staging of how Verena brought her along is worth the telling, because it is the whole method in one animal. The sorrel had been gathered out of a box canyon in the Pine Nut Range, and she was the most frightened thing on the place after Cola, a flighty blood bay with a blaze and 3 white socks, who had been run so hard at the gather that she would sweat and tremble at the mere sight of a coiled rope, any rope, even a clothesline, even Verena's soft braided one. The other wild ones settled into the calm herd in a week. The sorrel would not. She kept to the edge of the band with her head up, ready to run, eating nothing, going gaunt. "She's no good," young Pete said one evening, hanging on the pasture rail beside Verena, the 19-year-old hand with the bad sunburn and the eager face. "Holt says, cut her loose. She's eating and giving nothing back, and we got no days to waste." "How many days?" Verena said, watching the sorrel. 22, Pete said. He had taken to keeping the count too, the way the whole crew had, because the falling number had become the heartbeat of the place. 22 days, and we need her or one like her to make 40. Then we do not have days to waste cutting her loose and catching another wild one who is just as afraid, Verena said. We have days to spend on this one who is already caught. Watch." And she did a thing that made Pete's eyes go wide. She walked out into the herd to the trembling sorrel, slow, never straight at her, drifting up at an angle the way one horse drifts up on another. And when she was close, she turned her own back on the mare and stood, looking away at nothing, her broad shoulders loose, presenting the frightened animal with the one thing it had never been shown by a human being, indifference, the plain and powerful message that this large, quiet shape did not want anything from her at all. And the sorrel, who would run from any approach, could not run from a thing that was not approaching. She stood. She stretched her neck. She smelled the back of Verena's blue dress, the flour and the wood smoke and the sweat of her, and Verena did not turn around, and after a long while the mare lipped at her sleeve just once, testing, and Verena let her, and still did not turn, and Pete on the rail forgot to breathe. "You see," Verena said low, not to Pete, to the mare, "nothing. I want nothing from you. You may come and go as you like." And the next morning the sorrel was grazing in the middle of the band with the others, cured of the worst of it, because Verena had spent on her the one thing the breaking pen never had, which was the patience to do less. "How'd you know to turn your back?" Pete asked her that night at the supper table, in front of everyone, with the open hunger of a boy who has just glimpsed a thing he wants to be able to do. "My father," Verena said, and passed him the cornbread. "He turned his back on a horse for a whole afternoon once in the snow until his feet went numb, and the horse came and stood over him to keep him warm. A horse will run from what chases it and walk up to what ignores it, the same as people. You learn it once and you never forget it." And around the table, the hard men who had laughed at her in the yard 4 weeks before sat quiet and listened to the fat Dutch girl teach, and not one of them was laughing now. The gentling went on. The count went down. 38 days, and they had 12 Mustangs leading and standing for the saddle. 31 days, and the first 6 were carrying a rider at the walk, Holt himself swinging up onto their backs in the round pen, while Verena stood at their heads with her father's soft rope and talked them through it in her low German nonsense. And the horses that should have pitched a man into the rails instead flicked their ears back to listen to her, and stood. 26 days, and they had 20 head coming along, and the bunkhouse had stopped doubting and started believing, the younger hands competing now to learn her way, hanging on the fence in the evenings to watch her work, asking her questions, calling her Miss Verena instead of the cook. She taught them. That was the part that won the men, more than the saving of the foal even. She did not hoard what she knew the way Dell had always hoarded it. She stood in the round pen in the gold evening light, with her broad, capable frame and her flour-dusted bun and her blue work dress, and she taught a 19-year-old hand named Pete how to ask a horse to yield instead of forcing it, how to feel the moment the animal chose you, how to be the safe thing, and the boy looked at her with the open worship boys give to anyone who hands them mastery, and Verena, who had been the fat Dutch girl her whole life, felt something she had no word for in any of her languages, the feeling of being needed for what she could do rather than tolerated for what she could carry. The blue ribbon came back into the story around then, though it had been there all along. It had been her mother's, a single length of cornflower blue silk ribbon her mother had worn to her own wedding in the old country and given to Verena before she died, and Verena had carried it across the ocean folded in the family Bible, and she wore it in her hair on Sundays, the one small pretty thing she owned. One Sunday in September, working the herd because the army deadline did not keep the Sabbath, the ribbon came loose from her bun in the wind and lifted away and snagged on the corral rail, and the foal she had saved, grown leggy and bold now, took it up in his teeth and ran the length of the pasture with it, streaming blue from his mouth like a pennant. And the whole crew, Holt included, stood and laughed, the good kind, and Verena laughed with them, and Holt waded into the herd and got the ribbon back from the colt and brought it to her and put it in her hand, and his weathered fingers stayed a moment too long around hers, and neither of them said anything, and both of them knew. There was an evening around the 23rd day that Verena would keep folded away in her for the rest of her life, the way she kept her mother's ribbon folded in the Bible. She had stayed late at the round pen working a young blue roan, and the light had gone violet over the mountains, and the first stars had come out, and she found Holt Mercer sitting on an upturned barrel by the rebuilt section of fence, with a small thing in his hands, turning it over and over. She came up quiet, the way she came up on everything, and she saw what it was, a child's shoe, One small leather shoe, the size of a thing that would fit a baby of a year, never worn, the sole still smooth, the laces still in their first careful bow. He did not hide it when he saw her. That was a kind of trust, and she understood it as one. "Sarah made it," he said. He did not look up from the shoe. "Cut it out of my old chaps. Sat by the stove all that last winter, sewing the pair of them, getting them ready." His thumb moved over the small, smooth sole. "We never got the other one finished. Some things you only get the one of." Verena did not say she was sorry. She had been on the receiving end of enough sorrow that is only a word to know it, for the cheap coin it was. She sat down on the lower fence rail near him, which took her weight with a creak, and she folded her hands, and she did the thing her father had taught her, the only true thing she knew how to do, which was to become the safe, quiet shape that wanted nothing, and to wait. "2 winters back," Holt said after a long time, into the dark. "The baby came early and came wrong, and the doctor was 2 days off, and the snow was 4 feet in the pass. I held her hand the whole night, and there wasn't one thing my 2 hands could do. And I have got strong hands, Verena. I have fixed near everything that ever broke on this place with these hands. And that one night they were no more use to me than 2 stones." He set the small shoe down on his knee. "I buried them in the one box, her and the baby, up on the rise where she liked the wind, and I came back down here and I started breaking horses like I meant to break myself on them, because a man who is fighting something every day from sunup doesn't have to sit still long enough to feel the rest of it. Dell thinks I went hard. I didn't go hard. I went scared. Same as that black horse, roped and snubbed and fighting the post." He looked at her then, in the starlight. "First time I ever said any of that out loud." "I know," Verena said. "Only that." And she stayed on the fence rail beside him in the cold and the dark, while the young roan dozed in the pen and the stars wheeled, the 2 of them not touching, not needing to, 2 wounded things keeping the night between them like a small fire. And when at last he stood and said good night, his voice had something in it that had not been there at the gate 4 weeks before, and it was the beginning of being whole. 20 days. The black stallion carried his first rider, and the rider was Holt Mercer, and Verena stood at his head with her father's rope and her hand on Cola's scarred neck, and the horse that had killed Tom Avery led a man onto his back and walked the round pen, calm as a church, and 3 of the hands took their hats off without being told. Verena did not cry. She had not cried since the freight wagon, and she did not cry now. But she pressed her forehead to the black horse's jaw for a moment, and she whispered something in German that nobody heard, and it was her father's name. 18 days, and they had 33 head gentled and going, and needed 40, and there were enough wild ones left in the holding pen to make the number if nothing went wrong. And of course, this being the world and not a song, something went wrong. It went wrong in the dark, and it went wrong on purpose. And the man who did it was Del Stroud. Verena woke on the night of the 17th day before the deadline to the sound that every person raised in horse country knows in their marrow and dreads above all others. The high, broken scream of horses in panic, and under it a smell, and the smell was smoke. She was up and out of the 8x10 room in her shift before she was fully awake. And the night was orange. The hay barn was burning. Someone had fired the hay barn, and the wind that never quit was carrying sparks in a long, bright streamer straight across the yard toward the corrals where the whole $1,500 contract of gentled horses stood trapped behind rails, screaming, throwing themselves at the fence in the firelight. I want you to see it the way she saw it, because this is the moment the whole story turns. The barn, a tower of flame against the black mountains. The yard lit hellish orange, and the long banner of sparks riding the wind. The men spilling out of the bunkhouse, half-dressed and frozen, every hard frontier man of them, stopped dead at the edge of that heat, because a man's body will not by itself walk into fire, it has to be made to. And the horses dying of fear behind the rails, and if even one panicked animal broke through and the rest followed, they would scatter into the night desert and be gone, weeks of work and the whole army contract and the place itself running loose into the dark, and a stampeding herd in firelight will run itself off a cliff or into a fence and break its legs, and Holt Mercer would lose everything in the time it takes a barn to burn. Del Stroud stood at the edge of the firelight with an oil can still in his hand. He had not even run. He stood there with the flames lighting his sunburnt face and a look on it of a man watching a thing he had wanted to watch, and Verena saw the can, and she understood the whole of it in one breath, and she did not waste a second breath on him. She went to the horses. A big, heavy-set woman in a white shift ran straight at the burning corner of the corral where the panic was worst, where the gentle herd and the half-wild Mustangs were piling against the rails, and she did the one thing no man in that yard could have done, the thing that was hers and hers alone to do. She did not shout. She did not wave her arms. She climbed the rail into the screaming herd, into 40 terrified half-ton animals in the firelight, and she began to sing. It was her grandmother's lullaby, the low German nonsense she had used on the foal in the wash and on Kolo in the cold mornings, and she pitched it down low in her chest, where the big horses could feel it in the ground through their own feet, and it carried under the roar of the fire the way a low sound carries when a high sound cannot. The men on the bank were shouting, useless, high, frightened shouting, and the fire was a roar, and the horses were screaming, and through all of it, steady, unhurried, never breaking, came the low German lullaby of the heavy-set Dutch girl standing in the middle of 40 terrified animals, in her white shift with the firelight turning her gold, and the horses nearest her heard it, the ones she had gentled with her own hands and her own breath over more than 30 long days, the foal she had pulled from the wash, growing fast now, and the dun mare, and the brood mares, and the flighty sorrel she had cured by turning her back, and the blue roan, and the black stallion Cole, towering and plunging at the center of the panic with his white-rimmed eyes rolling. They heard, in the middle of the fire that told every animal instinct in them to run blind into the night, the one sound in all the world that had only ever meant safety. And a thing happened then that the men on that bank would tell for the rest of their lives, and that not one of them would ever be able to fully explain. The horses stopped throwing themselves at the fence. They turned, one by one, and then all together they turned away from the rails and toward the low gold sound, the way iron filings turn toward a lodestone, the way a lost child turns toward its mother's voice in a crowd, and they pressed in around her, trembling, blowing, but no longer trying to die. A panicked horse runs from the unknown and toward the known, and Verena Bauer had spent more than a month making herself the known thing, the safe thing, the only thing these horses would run toward instead of away from, and now, in the one moment, it could ever matter. She stood in the middle of the firelit corral and collected the debt that all that patient kindness had been quietly earning, and the herd came to her instead of going through the fence. She got her hand on Cola first because he was the leader, and the herd would do what he did, and she leaned her whole weight against his plunging shoulder and got her father's soft braided rope. The one that hung always over her shoulder now looped once around his neck, and she put her mouth close to his ear and sang to him alone for 3 breaths, and the great black horse that had killed a man shuddered down out of his panic and stood, and when the leader stood, the herd around him began to stand. "The gate!" she shouted between verses, never stopping the song longer than the words took. "Halt! The far gate, the dark gate, open it! They will follow me! Open it!" And Holt Mercer, who had been frozen at the rail like every other man, his body locked the way a body locks at the edge of fire, came unstuck at the sound of his own name in her mouth, the way the herd had come unstuck at her singing, and he understood, and he ran. He ran the long way around the outside of the burning corral, his arm thrown up against the heat to the far gate, the dark gate, the one that opened away from the flames onto the open night pasture, and he fought the wired latch with his bare hands, burning them, not feeling it, and he threw it wide and stood clear and shouted that it was open. And Verena walked. She did not run. You cannot run a panicked herd to safety. A herd that runs will run over the one leading it and over the fence and over a cliff in the dark, blind. You can only walk and let them follow the walking, because a horse that is following has decided somewhere in its great frightened heart that there is a thing worth following, and a horse that has decided that is no longer truly panicked. So Verena Bauer walked, singing, never once breaking the low German thread of it, through the middle of 40 half-ton animals, with the firelight at her back and her father's soft rope on the black stallion's neck and the saved foal pressed hard against her hip, walking slow and broad and unhurried toward the dark gate and the cool sage beyond, and the whole gentle herd came after her, flowing like water, finding the low place in a field out of the heat and the roar and the falling sparks, through the dark gate into the open night. She counted them as they passed her in the gateway by old habit, by her father's habit, the way she counted everything, the dun mare, the foal's mother, the sorrel with her 3 white socks, the roan, the brood mares, 1, 2, 3, 4, the wild ones gentled, Cola last of all, turning in the gate to put himself between the herd and the fire the way a stallion does, and then through. 40 head out of the fire and into the dark, and she stood in the open pasture and counted them safe. And the number she came to was the number that had been falling toward this night for more than a month, and not one of it was missing, while behind her the hay barn folded in on itself with a sound like the end of the world and threw a tower of sparks 100 feet into the black Nevada sky. She stood out in the dark pasture a long time after, in the cool, in her scorched shift, with the herd grazing around her, already calm, already forgetting the way horses do, and her hands were shaking now that it was over, and the black stallion Cola put his great scarred head over her shoulder and breathed against her hair, and she let herself shake. They found Del Stroud at the far end of the burned barn, trying to throw a saddle on a half-broke gelding to ride out before the count was taken. The oil can ditched, smoking in the ashes 10 feet behind him, and when Holt Mercer walked up out of the dark with the firelight still on his face and his burned hands hanging at his sides, Dell turned with the saddle still in his arms, and there was nothing left to say, and he tried to say it anyway. "You'd have lost the place regardless," Dell spat. "I just hurried it. On her say-so you was going under, Holt. I only—" "Ford ahead," Holt said. His voice was very quiet, which, from Holt, was the loudest thing in the world. "Ford ahead out the dark gate. Not one lost. She walked them out singing while you stood here with a can of oil." He looked at his foreman of 15 years a long moment, and what was in his face was not even anger any more. It was a kind of grief. "Set the saddle down, Dell. You're done?" The hands took him. He did not go quiet, but there were 8 of them, and a fired barn, and an oil can, with his name as good as written on it in the ashes, and they tied his hands and sat him on the bunkhouse step under a lantern until morning. The county sheriff came out from Carson City the next afternoon, a big, slow, careful man who looked at the oil can and the burned barn and the 40 horses grazing safe in the pasture, and took down what each man had to say. And at the end of it, he put Dell Stroud in irons in the bed of his wagon for arson and for the attempted ruin of a federal remount contract, which on the frontier in those years was the kind of thing a man could hang for, and drove him away. Verena stood in the cook-house doorway with a dish towel in her hands and watched the sheriff's wagon carry Dell Stroud off down the long, dusty road toward Carson, getting smaller and smaller against the silver sage, and the crew expected her, maybe, to feel something fierce, some sweet, hot taste of the score, even at last. She did not. She felt only the old cold pity she had felt at the auction rail of her whole life, because a man who would burn 40 living horses to ashes to spite a woman for the crime of outworking him is a man already living inside a fire of his own making, a worse fire than the one that took the barn, and you cannot gentle a thing that has decided to burn. She turned back into the kitchen and put the coffee on because the men would be hungry after a night like that, and a hungry man does not heal, and there was healing yet to do on that place. 15 days. The hay barn was a black ruin, and they had lost the winter feed stacked inside it, which was a hard blow because winter feed in that country meant the difference between a herd that came through to spring and a herd that did not, and Verena added it to the list of things she would have to find an answer for before the snow. But they had not lost a single horse, and the gentling had not stopped, and the count, the falling count, the only count that mattered now, went on. 14 days, and the crew, what was left of it after Dell, threw themselves at the work like men who had something to prove, because they did. They had stood frozen at a rail while a woman walked into a fire, and a man does not forget standing frozen, and the only cure for the shame of it is to work twice as hard at the thing she taught him. Young Pete could halter and lead a green Mustang on his own now, talking it down in a fair imitation of Verena's low murmur. And she stood at the rail and watched him do it, and felt the particular pride of a teacher whose student has surpassed the need for her, which is the only pride worth having. 12 days, and Holt and the hands rebuilt enough of the breaking pen and threw up a rough pole shed over the salvaged feed, working dawn to dark, and still found the hours to bring the horses along, because the herd did most of the work now, and the men only had to finish what the calm band had started. 9 days, and they had 39 head saddled gentle and army quiet, soft to the bit and steady to mount. And they were 1 short, and 1 short was the same as 20 short to the United States Army. 6 days, and Verena brought along the very last wild one, a flighty blue-gray filly off the open range, who should by every rule have taken a month and gentled her in 6 days flat, because the whole herd was calm now, and the calm did the teaching far faster than any human hand, and the filly had only to learn from the 40 quiet horses around her that the world was safe, and she learned it in less than a week. And then they had their 40 head, gentled, not broken. Every one of them quiet under a saddle, soft to the bit, steady to a strange leg thrown over, safe enough for the most frightened farm boy the army ever put in uniform to sit without being killed, not one ruined, not one bowed or sprung or sullen, not one dead, with 3 days to spare before the 1st of October. Holt Mercer stood at the pasture fence in the cold morning of that day and looked at 40 wild horses standing gentle in the sun, the contract made, the place saved, and he did not say anything for a long while. Then he said, "Not to anyone. 15 years." And Verena, beside him, knew what he meant and did not make him say the rest. But the winter feed was still gone, burned to ash in the barn, and a saved contract is no good to a herd that starves before spring. And so 2 evenings before they were to drive the horses to the fort, Verena sat at the cookhouse table with the old cook's ledger and the stub of a pencil, and did the other arithmetic, the one nobody had thought to do. There was a wide bottomland along the creek at the south end of the place. She had walked it in August carrying water, and it had stood thick and uncut all season in wild rye and meadow grass, gone tall and gold and seedy, because every hand on the place had been at the corrals fighting horses, and nobody had been left to swing a scythe. "There is hay standing in your south bottom," she told Holt that night. "Wild rye, a man's waist high, enough to winter the brood mares and the saddle stock both, if we cut it now, before the first hard frost lays it down and ruins it. It will not cut itself, and we have 2 days before the drive, and the whole crew on horses." She set the pencil down. "So we cut it tomorrow, all of us, from dark to dark. The horses can stand 1 day ungentled. They cannot stand a January with no hay. And the next day, the whole place, Holt and Pete and the 6 remaining hands, and Verena Bower, in her oldest dress with her sleeves to the elbow, went down into the south bottom in the gray dawn with every scythe and sickle and hand-rake the ranch owned, and they cut hay from dark to dark, a long line of them swinging through the gold rye with the dust rising and the grasshoppers scattering, and Verena worked the line same as the men, her broad back bending and rising, her heavy arms swinging the scythe in the long, even strokes her father had taught her in another country a lifetime ago, outcutting 2 of the younger hands and never once stopping to rest while they did. And by the time the dark came down, there were a dozen long windrows of cut hay drying in the bottom, and there was winter feed, and the place would come through to spring after all. She had seen the lack and closed it with her 2 hands, the same as she had closed every lack on that place since the day she walked through the gate, and Holt Mercer, leaning on his scythe in the last light, watching her finish her row, understood for the 100th time, and the first time all over again, exactly what had been delivered to his door the afternoon. He called it a feed wagon. They drove the 40 head the long 40 miles west into Carson City on the last day of September, 2 days on the trail, moving slow so as not to undo the gentling with a hard push, Holt Mercer riding the black stallion Cola at the head of the herd and the crew flanking, and Verena Bower riding the saved foal's mother at the point beside Holt in her good blue dress with her mother's cornflower ribbon in her hair. and the 40 wild horses came down off the high desert behind her in a quiet, steady column. No scattering, no fighting, the calm flowing back from the leaders through the whole band the way it had flowed out of the fire. The remount officer who came out to receive them was a gray-mustached major named Holloway, who had bought better than 1,000 horses for the United States Cavalry in his time and seen every kind of broke and half-broke and ruined horse the frontier could turn out. And he was a hard man to impress and prouder of being hard to impress than of anything else about himself. He came out across the remount yard with 2 clerks and a sergeant, expecting the usual delivery, a dozen good ones and a dozen passable ones, and a handful of snubbed-down outlaws the contractor was hoping he would not look at too close. He stopped 6 feet from the herd, and he went still. Then he walked the line. He took his time. He ran his old hands down 40 pairs of forelegs, feeling for the heat of a strain and the knot of a bow, and found none. He lifted 40 feet. He looked into 40 eyes, because a major who has bought 1,000 horses knows that the eye tells the truth a sound leg can hide, and he was looking for the white-rimmed flinch of a broken-spirited animal, the one that stands quiet in the yard and blows up under a recruit a year later when the bad memory floods back. He did not find it. He found 40 horses that looked back at him calm and curious and unafraid. Wild horses that had never been choked down or beaten or run to a standstill, that had simply been taught somehow that the world held nothing to fear. He put his own boot to the stirrup of the worst-looking one, the scarred black stud at the head of the line, and the sergeant made a sound of warning, and the major swung up anyway, and the horse that had killed a man stood and then walked off quiet as a Sunday horse, and Major Holloway rode him in a slow circle of the receiving corral with his face working, and came back and got down. 22 years, he said. He took off his hat. He took it off to Verena Bauer, in front of his sergeant and his clerks and the whole crew, which is a thing United States Army majors did not do for anyone, let alone a heavy-set immigrant woman in a flower-mended dress. I have been receiving remounts for the cavalry of this country for 22 years, ma'am, and I have never once, not one single time, been delivered 40 wild range horses gentled to this kind. There is not a flinch in the lot. Who broke these animals? Nobody broke them, Verena said. We gentled them. The major looked at Holt, and Holt Mercer looked at Verena, and he said in front of the major and his clerks and his own crew of hands, in a voice that carried clear down the line, "She did, Major, every head. This is Verena Bauer, and she is the best horseman in the state of Nevada, and I would not have a ranch or a contract or a single horse standing without her, and that is the truth in front of God and the United States Army." The major paid out the contract in full, $1,520, 40 head at $38 apiece, counted into Holt Mercer's hand in Army gold, enough to save the place and rebuild the barn and lay in the winter feed and start again. And it had been done by patience and a flat hand and time, and the daughter of a small, quiet German horse gentler, done by the fat Dutch girl that Cora Pruitt had matched to a desperate man as a thing nobody else would take. They had kept Cola and the foal's mother back from the sale because Holt had told the major plain that those two were not for the army at any price. And so they rode home from the fort on the 2 horses Verena had gentled first, the killer stallion turned gentle, and the mare whose foal she had pulled from the wash, the 2 of them and the crew strung out behind. And at the fork of the road, Holt sent the hands on ahead to make the place ready and held his own horse back. And Verena, without being asked, held hers back too. They rode the last miles alone in the dusk, the herd delivered, and the army gold heavy in the saddlebag, and the long blue shadows of the two horses running out ahead of them over the silver sage, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, the way two people who have walked out of the same fire together do not need to fill the quiet with talk. The light went from gold to rose to the deep blue of the first stars. Somewhere off in the sage a coyote tuned up and quit. And then Holt Mercer reined in the black stallion, and Verena reined in the mare beside him, and he sat his horse a moment, turning his hat in his hands the way he always did when a thing cost him to say, and then he put the hat back on his head and looked at her square in the last of the light, with 2 years of frozen grief finally and fully broken up in him and carried off down river like spring ice. And he said the thing he had been failing to say since the morning he first watched her lay her flat hand on a killer horse and not be killed. "I told you the first day you weren't what I paid for," he said. "I remember," Verena said. "I was a fool that didn't know his own luck." He looked down at his weathered hands on the reins, and then back up at her, and a hard man laid his whole heart out in the open like a thing he was finally not ashamed to be seen carrying. "I've been alone 2 years, Verena. I told myself I'd stay alone the rest of it. I didn't send for a wife. I sent for hands, for a cook, for help getting through. And Cora Pruitt sent me the only thing on this earth that could have saved me, and I had the gall to be disappointed at the gate." His voice went rough. "You didn't just gentle my horses, you gentled me. I've been a wild thing 2 years, fighting the rope, half killing myself and everybody near me, no use to a living soul, because I was so busy fighting what I'd lost. And you walked through my gate, and you set up at my rail every single morning before the light, and you waited me out the same patient way you waited out that black stud, asking me for nothing, just being the one safe thing on the place until I was ready to come to it, and I never once saw you doing it to me. I thought I was watching you gentle the horses." His voice went rough, and he let it. "I was the horse, Verena. You gentled me right alongside the rest of them, and I'd not have known it till the day I died if I hadn't sat my horse out here tonight and finally let myself feel how it is when you're near, which is the first time in 2 years a thing has felt like standing instead of fighting." He stopped, started again, lower, all the way down to the bottom of it. "I don't want hands. I never really wanted hands. I don't want a cook. I want you to stay, and I want you to stay as my wife, the whole real and proper meaning of the word, because I love you, plain as that, and because you belong here on this place with me more than any soul I have ever known or am ever going to. Will you have me, Verena Bauer, a fool that took 50 days and a barn fire to see what was sent to his own gate?" Verena Bauer sat the foal's mother in the gold dusk on the Nevada sage, with her mother's cornflower ribbon stirring in her hair, the heavy-set Dutch girl that an ocean and a continent and a whole hard life had taught to expect nothing and ask for less. And she looked at the rough, decent, weathered man who had just told her, in front of nobody but the horses and the coming stars, that she belonged. "I crossed an ocean," she said, and her careful accented voice was not quite steady. "And I crossed a country, and at the end of it a man looked at me and said I was not what he paid for. And I told myself, Verena, you will work, And you will not need to be wanted, because wanting is for other women." She breathed. "I was wrong. I needed it more than I knew, and I will have you, Holt Mercer. I will stay, and it will not be because there is nowhere else to go. It will be because here, on this place, with you, is the only place I have ever in my life been seen." He reached across the space between the two horses and took her broad, capable hand in his weathered one, and the black stallion stood quiet, and the herd grazed in the falling dark. And that was the whole of the asking and the whole of the answer, and they rode the last mile home in the starlight with their hands joined across the gap between them, which had not been a gap at all, it turned out, but only the last little distance a frightened thing crosses on its own when it finally believes it is safe. They were married 3 weeks later, under the big cottonwood by the rebuilt barn on a bright, cold October Saturday, and the whole county came, the same county that had laughed in the yard not 3 months before, because word of the woman who walked a herd out of a fire singing had run ahead of her clear to Carson City and beyond, and they came partly to see if such a thing could be true, and they stayed because it plainly was. Among them came a few who had been in the yard the first afternoon. There was a cattle buyer named Probst, who had been at the corral the day she arrived and called out, loud, that Holt had been sold a brood sow in a dress, and he came to the wedding because everyone came, and Verena saw him standing at the edge of the gathering, turning his hat in his hands and not meeting her eye. She walked over to him before the vows, in her deep blue dress with the cornflower ribbon in her hair, and she put out her hand to him plain and open, and the man went red to his collar and took it and could not get a word up out of his throat, and Verena said only, "Welcome. There is pie when this is done," and turned away and left him standing there having eaten, in front of the whole county, every word he had ever said about her, without her raising her voice once. That was how she made the cruel eat their words. Not with triumph, with a kindness they could not answer. Verena wore her one good dress, deep blue, and her mother's cornflower ribbon in her hair, and the foal she had saved, a sturdy half-grown weanling now, wore a length of the same blue silk braided into his mane, because young Pete had begged her to let him do it, and the black stallion Cola stood saddled at the fence rail, watching the whole thing with both ears forward, gentle as a house cat, the horse that had killed a man, gentled by a woman nobody had wanted. Holt Mercer took her hand under the cottonwood, and the parson said the words, and when it came to the part where the man may speak if he has a thing to say, Holt turned to the gathered county, the ranch hands and the town folk and the buyers and the gossips who had called her the fat Dutch girl, and he said only this: 15 years I lived in this county before I ever saw what was in front of me. This woman gentled 40 wild horses with her 2 hands and saved my place from the fire and gentled me right along with them. Anybody here who ever called her a thing other than the finest woman in Nevada, you called it wrong, and you'll not call it that again. And he kissed his wife under the cottonwood while the whole county stood silent, the buyers and the gossips and the men who had laughed in the yard. And then, slowly, beginning with young Pete, clapping his rough hands together hard and unashamed, and spreading from him outward the same exact way the calm had spread through her herd, one and then a few, and then all of them, the county began to clap, until the sound of it rolled out across the rebuilt barn and the gold pasture, and startled the grazing horses into lifting their heads, and Cola at the rail flicked his ears at the noise, and did not so much as shift his weight, gentle to the bone. Verena Bauer, who had been the fat Dutch girl, who had been $4 a month and the last woman a marriage agent could place, who had been sent across an ocean to a man who did not want her at his gate, stood under the cottonwood in her deep blue dress with her dead mother's cornflower ribbon in her hair, and her husband's arm around her broad shoulders, and her father's horse sense in her two capable hands, and the whole gentle county clapping. And she understood at last the thing her father had tried to tell her when she was a girl, with his soft braided rope in her small hands, that the wild and the wounded and the unwanted are not gentled by force, that they are gentled by the one patient soul who stands at the rail every morning and refuses to leave, who becomes the safe thing and waits, however long it takes, for the frightened heart to walk across the empty space on its own and choose, at last, to be held. She had been that patient soul for a herd of broken horses and for a broken man. And in the end, in the gold October light under the cottonwood, with everything she had ever wanted and never let herself ask for finally and fully hers, it was Verena Bauer's own long-guarded, ocean-crossed, much-mocked heart that was gentled and chosen and at last brought home